So in my last video, I spoke about the concept of rights. I wanted to keep it more theoretical and have that discussion really be about the idea, what is a right, where do these ideas come from? Now, in the feedback, some of you asked me to talk about the actual Constitution of Canada and where our rights here come from, as opposed to more of the philosophical or theoretical idea, which I still want to explore a bit more, but in this video, I think we'll tackle some of the more practical things. So let's start right at the beginning. We're going to jump right in. So first of all, we have to address what is a constitution, where do our rights come from. You guys have heard words like the charter. I spoke last time about the charter being repatriated, so what does that kind of thing mean? And we'll explore all these ideas, but first, the definitions. So the definition of a constitution. A lot of people tend to think, I think, about the American Constitution. They might understand the charter or know what the charter is, but not necessarily understand it as sort of a constitution. It's really a part of Canada's constitutional laws, but the Constitution itself is an important idea that we need to understand. And so a constitution, in its most basic sense, is a set of principles or laws. These are sort of the underlying foundational laws that a nation or state would have, and this basically talks about how the state is going to be governed. It can have about the rights or the requirements. It can talk about when a government has to meet. So, for example, how often the parliament or the legislature or the Congress needs to sit. So these are the basic laws that a country would have. Now, interestingly enough, you would say, okay, well, I guess every country has a constitution. If you look at, for example, the United Kingdom, so you can see right here, the United Kingdom, because of its age and historical precedents, does not actually have a single document like the Americans. So the Americans in 1776 declare independence. There's the Declaration of Independence. And then later on, there's the Constitution of the United States and all the amendments. And you guys are, I'm sure, familiar with the First and Second Amendment, at the very least, if not maybe some of the other ones. But the Constitution can be a single written document, or it can be a group of documents. And this is actually what Canada had. So if we go to these guys, these are the founding fathers of the country. At the time when Canada was created as a singular entity made up of the original 4 provinces, there was an act in the British Parliament known as the British North America Act, the BNA Act. This was in 1867, and this is commonly referred to today as the Constitution Act 1867, but this is really the founding document that says, okay, you guys are going to be a confederation. This is going to be a new Commonwealth country that is going to be called Canada. It's made up of these 4 provinces, the 4 original provinces. And so this is sort of the first attempt at a constitution. So at this point, in 1867, we're still not like the Americans with a singular document constitution, because we have what's called British common law, and that's again similar to what's going on actually in the UK, where sets of laws, sets of legal precedent all combine to sort of make up our constitution. Now, this continues all the way until 1931, in which the Statute of Westminster, which is another law that was passed in the UK, that basically said that certain parts of the Commonwealth would be given self-rule. They would be given the ability to self-govern, and so this act sort of made up an additional part of Canada's rights. Now, interestingly enough, because we did not have our own constitution, and because we were so tied into Britain, as we still are in many ways today, the Queen is the official head of state, the Governor General, as her representative, is the official head of state on paper, as much as the Prime Minister might actually be the de facto head of state, which is the in reality head of state. But the way that our constitution was set up and the way that our laws were set up, the Supreme Court of Canada actually was not even the highest court in the country. The highest court in the country was actually something called the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, and that's in the UK. So you could appeal everything all the way to the Supreme Court, but then you didn't like the Supreme Court decision, so you could appeal to what's called the JCPC, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council, and so that's where the final decisions would be made. Now, why is this relevant to the Constitution, or why is this relevant to everything before we even get into the Charter? So first of all, again, the Constitution sets up basic laws. It sets out your rights and freedoms. So prior to 1982, you have your rights contained in a number of different places. You would have the Canadian Bill of Rights 1960 and the Canadian Human Rights Act 1977. But because of the fact that none of these is actually in a constitutional document, it creates a bit of difficulty for the judiciary, so for the courts, to try and figure out which one of the rights, how the government is going to apply, or what happens if your rights are violated, because some of the governance documents and some of the rights documents are all in different places. And so the court really has to sort of figure it out. And again, in the UK, to use the UK example, because they don't have a written constitution, that on one hand might be difficult, but they have centuries of British common law and precedent where court cases have been decided and how government is going to respect or uphold human rights. So they have a lot of that history, and that's why for them it's a bit easier to figure things out. So back to Confederation and back to the Founding Fathers. So again, we have a number of different documents. Then comes Pierre Elliott Trudeau, so the elder Trudeau, and he decides that Canada is going to have its own constitution. So we're going to have to what's called repatriate our constitution. Again, unlike the Americans who started off as British colony, much as we did, they decided to break away, declare independence, so they have the Declaration of Independence, and then they have the Constitution. With us, because we stayed part of the Commonwealth, we stayed part of the British Empire, we never had that. So we had to repatriate, so repatriating, bring our Constitution back home, as it's commonly referred to. So we had to bring that back home. And that was done in 82. So that is what is called the Constitution Act 82. That's where the charter was adopted. So here you can see this is the Constitution Act 1982, and this is also the charter, but it's got many sections, and there's a lot of things about how you apply it and where the rights and the responsibilities come from. What is the role? You can see I was looking up some principles here. So this is the Constitution Act 1982, and again, this is when Canada officially gets its own constitution. So this is now the highest document, the highest legal document in the country. And so we can use this to understand how we're going to apply other rights, how we're going to understand different rights, and how we're going to balance rights between individuals and operations of the state. So this is all the document, and I do want to go through some of the charter just to talk about some of the issues because, again, because of the coronavirus crisis, many people have questions. What right does the government have to make these decisions, these sometimes arbitrary seeming decisions? What right does the government have, and what are my rights, and how are those two things balanced? But just before there, you can see here's a nice video of, this is 1982 when the Queen came to actually sign the charter. So she signed it, which again begs all kinds of interesting questions about the sort of independence of Canada. Again, we're still very tied to the British monarchy, and I think there's some people who have some issues with that. Some people who some people do not have issues with that. For me, it really all depends on, I guess, the de facto state of affairs, which means the in reality state of affairs. I think there's a lot to be said for tradition, and there's a lot to be said for institutions, especially very old institutions. So you shouldn't necessarily throw them out immediately. And really, it all depends on how things are in practice, right? In Canada, we have a lot of ties to the British monarchy, but we're not necessarily, on an everyday, day-to-day basis, we're not really run by the British monarchy or by the British Parliament. So, again, there's a lot to parse out there. I think maybe that's a topic for another video. But regardless, I just wanted to pull up this this cool video and show you a bit of that history, the Canadian history. So here, back to the Constitution Act 1982. So this is the charter, and this part of the video, if you've been watching until now, this part of the video, we're actually going to go through some of the charter and try and talk about what that means. So again, here is the Constitution Act 1982. This is now the highest law of the land. So right off the bat, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. In my last video, I spoke about sort of the natural rights, the God-given rights, the inalienable rights, the rights that you have or that is believed you have simply because you are a person, and then the rights that government has to give to you. These are the positive, again, and negative rights. The negative rights, leave me alone, you don't need to do anything. So freedom of speech, just let me say what I want. Positive rights, you have to give me something. I have a right to education, a right to health, right to housing, all these type of things. So again, it's important, I think, that the supremacy of God is in there because it speaks to, I guess, the inalienable and natural rights of the person. So we have here that the Canadian Charter of Rights guarantees rights and freedoms set on it subject only to reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So here we go. This is sort of right off the bat, I guess, an interesting one. And this talks about the limits. Now, obviously, you can think there might be limits or when there will be a limit on somebody's rights. That's if they break a law or if they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing, then obviously their rights would have to be violated because that prevents them from violating other people's rights. So again, you commit a crime, you're arrested, suddenly you don't have the right to go anywhere, you don't have the right to do a number of the things you used to do, you've lost your free speech. You probably should still have the right to remain free of unlawful search and seizure, which is in here, but you've lost a number of rights, and that is very justifiable because that's what it takes to keep an orderly and lawful society. So right off the bat here, this is sort of one of the founding principles. Then we get to the actual freedoms. So this is the freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, expression, freedom of the press and of other media and communication, freedom of peaceful assembly, freedom of association. Implied in this one, interestingly enough, is freedom to not associate. So I can choose to associate, but I can also choose not to associate. Some very interesting legal cases there that maybe I'll talk about in another video. So these are sort of the fundamental freedoms. Then here's the democratic rights, talking about the right to vote, talking about in time of war, or what must be done in the House of Commons. This one is especially interesting because the coronavirus crisis is put to the test some of these sort of democratic principles. There was quite an issue with the House meeting, or not meeting rather, early on until we got some of the virtual parliamentary sittings able to be done. And so that again is very interesting since it specifically outlines what happens to do in what should we do in a wartime. Whereas this one, again, this is a crisis, a pandemic, probably not thought of when the authors wrote this, but again, some parallels there. Mobility rights, talking about moving and remaining in Canada, moving to different provinces. These are the legal rights. You have the right to life, liberty, security of the person, the right to be secure against unreasonable search and seizure, so I spoke about that just before. The right to not be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned. Again, some very important, very fundamental rights. And in the legal rights, as opposed to sort of the fundamental freedoms, so right now, the government is not, I don't think anyone is arguing the government is violating your freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. I don't think they're talking about some of these other rights, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, peaceful assembly, maybe because you can't really go anywhere. Freedom of association, again, you can't really go anywhere, so that's somewhat connected. But the real one is the legal rights. The right to not be arbitrarily detained, the right to not be imprisoned. That's again, sort of bordering with the stay-home orders, with the property rights. You can go to your cottage, you cannot go to your cottage. These type of rights, and I think this is where people are finding that question: where have our rights gone? What are happening to our rights, and how do we sort of make sense of all these things? Because rights are, I guess, the most basic fundamental block of building a society. The fact that everyone is equal and has rights is something that's not common throughout history, because throughout history you would have had maybe rulers, aristocrats, the wealthy, landowners, different categories of people, maybe different races, different categories of people. They had different rights than perhaps others, so you could have a slave or a indentured servant or a bondsman. These people would have less rights, maybe no rights, than different categories of people. So, the everyone here, everyone, that's really critical. And again, that's part of the discussion right now. If everyone, then how are you telling me this? How are you telling me to stay home? How are you telling me all these things? Because everyone, it's not just, some people. So again, this is all part of that discussion ongoing right now that I think is important for us to look at. The most important part, though, that I think most people do not know or understand, and I'm going to have to Control F to find, is the right here. So this is the, this is the male and female. That's the not the correct notwithstanding. This is section 33. Okay, section 33. Now, this is the, I think, most misunderstood part of the charter of the Canadian Constitution, and I want to talk about it because it doesn't really exist in the same way in a lot of other countries, and this is what is called the notwithstanding clause. So notwithstanding clause here, I'll read it out first and then we'll talk about it. Parliament or legislature of a province may expressly declare an act of Parliament or of the legislature, as the case may be, that any act or provision thereof shall operate notwithstanding a provision, not including a provision, including in section 2 or sections 7 to 15. So again, section 2, this is up here. this is your fundamental freedoms, or 7 to 15, the legal rights, all the way down here to 15, inequality rights. Okay, so what does that mean? Back to section 33, back to the notwithstanding clause. So, okay, that means that Parliament, so the federal Parliament, or a provincial legislature can especially declare that an act of Parliament or of the legislature is going to be in effect regardless of what it says in section 2 or sections 7 through 15. So again, theoretically, a provincial government could pass a law saying that you do not have freedom of religion, right? There's only going to be one official religion. Or you do not have freedom of association. You do not have the right going forward to be safe from unlawful search and seizure. So theoretically, a province could pass that, and therefore your rights as guaranteed by the Charter are now not guaranteed because Section 33, the notwithstanding clause, has sort of unguaranteed them in a particular sense. Again, this brings up a lot of discussion of when is it valid, when is it a right that is permanent, that it can never be violated, are there times when it is appropriate to be violated. This section, it is important to note, has never been used on the federal level. So the House of Commons has never actually had to use the notwithstanding clause, but provinces have used the notwithstanding clause, and the most famous example is Quebec with some of the language laws. I should pull up a link here. I'll try and pull it up in a second, but some of the language laws in Quebec, then those ones you get around the Charter because there's a notwithstanding clause that's being invoked, and therefore they can just get away and say, okay, well, we understand that it says these rights here, and we believe in these rights. However, the notwithstanding because of special issues in Quebec, special dynamics in Quebec, so therefore we believe that this particular right it's more important to enforce another right, which is language rights and French language rights, as opposed to this right of people. So it's important to look at these rights and the notwithstanding clause in one context, that it can be used to differentiate between rights, or perhaps reorder the rights in different tiers. So you might say, okay, well, you have two competing rights, but we're going to now reorder them. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, we don't think you have freedom of religion, we don't think you have freedom of conscience. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. It could be simply a reordering of different rights that are competing. And so that is something that I think is something we need to keep in mind. But regardless, the fact that there is a Section 33 that is different than I think a lot of other countries, where they have a straight section that talks about how we're going to deal with this, is very important on one hand. But again, this all ties into the fact that you have to have, and I mentioned in my previous video, you have to have a society that is willing to uphold your rights. And in our society, in the times that we're living in, it's the government that is upholding your rights. So in a certain sense, the government is giving your rights, and I'm going to, using quote marks, the government is giving you your rights, because ultimately it doesn't matter if the rights are inalienable and they're God-given, because the government, society at large, is upholding those rights for you. But then again, here we're talking about the way how to deal with those rights. And so the Charter as a document, again, is super important, because not only did it finally bring together, as in 1982, did it finally bring together the laws of the land in Canada under one document, which makes it much easier and sort of more important. It codifies them as the basic law of this country, but it's important because right now a lot of the discussion should revolve around the Constitution, around the Charter, and around our rights, because we can't talk about rights unless we all understand rights in the same way, and that's what this document is trying to do. Now, I do want to set up for the next video, and I want to talk about, you may have heard this concept of the Constitution or the Charter as a living, breathing document. You may have heard from the U.S. People talking about the Constitution literally, or reading into it different things. So I want to talk about that, and that's a bit of a complex issue, and that's how we understand the Charter going forward. How do you read this document? I mean, this was written in 1982, so much more recent, but if you're talking about other documents, how do you read them if they're 200, 300, 400 years old, or in the case of British common law, how do you read that if this is like 800 years old, right? So something about to talk about for another video. But other than that, I really hope that everyone found this video somewhat useful. And if you have any questions about the Constitution, I'd love to be able to try and explore that together with you. And, keep posted. Subscribe to our YouTube channel here at True North. I know a lot of the True North contributors, my colleagues, are talking about a lot of very, very important things. There's a lot of discussions going on right now. Many of them have especially been speaking about gun rights, which is super, super important. And I might even talk about that depending on where we are sort of in a week or so. But so definitely subscribe. Stay tuned. Like our social media pages and follow us so you can stay up to date on the latest information. Other than that, have a great day. Wash your hands, stay safe, and I'm Sam Eskenasi for True North. Thanks so much, and hope you enjoyed.